Titash is the name of a river. Its banks were once home to the writer Advaita Malabarman. His posthumous novel Titash Ekti Nodi Naam was published in 1956. It memorialized the river of his childhood and the Malo fishing community who depended upon it, a community which was uprooted with the loss of the river, an environmental crisis represented in the novel. In 1973, the neo-Marxist filmmaker Ritti Ghatak adapted Malabarman's novel. Ghatak sought to find the pre-partition past of his childhood in eastern Bengal, but in doing so documented the landscape of the recently independent Bangladesh, still marked by the wreckages of the war. Through a hyper-narrative of river, writer, and filmmaker, this presentation attempts to trace an eco-poetical sense of time latent within, an affective, immemorious dimension to riverine life, which I broadly term as flux. Heraclitus was perhaps the first to analogize the cosmic with the riverine. Both were structures of flux, that which Plato summarized as the doctrine of panthere, or everything flows. In other words, the river figured an ontology of momentary things, a restlessness of form. The river speaks to the inherent rheology of all matter. Frederick Engels described this doctrine as a primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world. Indeed, for Engels, in the space-time of industrial capitalism, the principle of panthere was unmistakable. Quote, everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, constantly changing, constantly coming into being and passing away. In other words, all that is solid melts into air. However, beyond the metaphoric life of rivers in pre-Socratic thought or Marxist social theory, one must note that the temporality of rivers also shape the concrete and empirical realities of Eastern Bengal. The lives and works of Malabarman and Ghatak testify to this temporal phenomenology. Moreover, we must note that both men were displaced in their lifetimes and responded as artists to the liquid foundations of a region that underwent drastic reterritorializations of its physical, political, and human geographies. Thus, flux is not only the gestural name for a kind of philosophical musing or abstraction, but also serves as a plausible analytic and aesthetic category for understanding 20th century Bengali history. By drawing out a single connected life history of river, novelist, and filmmaker, this presentation looks at Titash through its jostling layers of historical time, the time of the river, the time represented in the novel, that is, of Malabarman's upbringing, the time of Malabarman's actual writing of the novel in Kolkata, in which partition is a time marker, the time of Ghatak's film, which both reconstructs a lost pre-partition past while navigating the revision of the space in the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, and also the time of the future, this eschatological tinge in Titash, this auguring of the future, as Navida Khan describes it, which has, of course, a haunting quality today in light of the dire forms of calculus that communities across the global south make with the acceleration of environmental crises. Malabarman was born in 1914 in a small village called Buklarnagat, located now in Brahmanbaria, Bangladesh. His novel, its form and substance, is rooted in the memories, ethics, and aesthetics of the Malo fishing community he was born into. Malabarman's novel was thus marked by a class and caste positionality rarely represented in Bengali literature at the time. Malabarman as a working-class writer, and Titash as a text of Dalit consciousness, as Drishadwadi Barghes argue, broke the romantic elitist gaze of this genre. Titash is just an ordinary river, begins the novel. To place its origins in deep time would, for our purposes, digress from the novelist's framing point about the ordinariness of the river, which is also a point about the prosaic connectedness of riverine in human time in the Bengal Delta. Malabarman is interested in the history of the non-monumental, the unrecorded instances that underlie most of recorded time. As for the river itself, quote, no one will find its name in history books and in the chronicles of national upheavals. Its waters were never tainted with the lifeblood of people from two groups locked in battle. But as Malabarman challenges us to consider, does this mean that it is really without history? Instead, its banks are imprinted with stories of a mother's affection, a brother's love, the caring of a wife, sister, a daughter. Malabarman frames this as Durudir Ittihash, or compassionate history. Bargi further suggests that for Malabarman, compassion is not merely what the history is, but also how it is preserved. Even as this non-monumental history is effaced from the world in the loss of its traces, in the generational forgetting of names and stories, or in the erasure of homes by the very river. Malabarman suggests they remain hidden, quote, hidden within the breast of the river, deathless and written in letters that children cannot practice on paper. Similar to the narrator of Proust de la Temps Perdu, Malabarman's Titash expresses a hope in the imperishability of memories, that lost worlds are never truly lost, but rather are out there ensouling the world. In Titash, all houses lead to the river. Waves mingle in thoughts. Fishermen, unaware of the origins of the river itself, regarded as an eternal fact, a lock of hair in Mahakal's mythic dance, tracing the frenzied outline of all of Bengal's rivers. In other words, the river is part of a Malo cosmology. Ecology is not a blank, disenchanted medium of settlement and exploitation. Rather, ecology is socialized, ritualized, and moralized. It is an active presence in everyday life. The novel is thus filled with poignant descriptions of riverine and human affects, intermingling a poetic and anthropomorphic tendency that almost prefigures the legal personhood of rivers that have happened recently in India and Bangladesh. And I have one quote here: over the water hovers a layer of steam like pale smoke. Fishermen dip their hands and feet in the water under that fog steam to feel the slight warmth mysteriously stored there for them, so like the warmth of a mother's body as she sleeps next to her child under the rag quilt. The riverine underpins not only cultural life, the river is also associated with a moral economy shared between Muslim peasants and Malo fishermen, a class and producer's ethic that transcends the occupational and religious differences between them. In one passage, two seasonal farm laborers share a dialogue. Having worked all day, rhythmically chanting Ali, 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 and Allah, Allah, Mumin, two men reflect on being provided rice and catfish curry by their employer while speculating what meager meals their wives are eating back at home. This provokes a sense of angst, as one states, when I'm eating rice and 5 things to go with it at the employer's place, I can't help thinking of her, and the food sticks in my throat. They reflect on their wives' hands. One wife's hand is calloused by farm work. The other is full of pinpricks from sewing. Quote, her fingers are scarred with 1,000 holes and scratches from the needle. She's sewing quilts in others' homes, and I feel that needle going through my heart. We find several moments of economic reasoning and critique represented in Malabarman's novel, evincing the organic intellectual capacity of fishermen and peasants, a point that Gramsci had theorized in The Southern Question, but which Malabarman had known and seen throughout his life. Through the bonds of ecology, economy, and culture, Malabarman evokes the eclipsed world of a pre-partition Bengal, in which Muslims and Hindus were not singularly determined by religious identity. Rather, they shared a common society of customs, languages, and beliefs. Holi, Kali Puja, Muharram all function as civic festivals. Stories of Karbala and Jarigan bring tears to the eyes of Malo villagers, and it is the Muslim family of Qadar Miah who is enthused above all to participate in the holy boat race and festivities. That was the world of Malabarman's childhood. The novel that remembers this world, however, was written in extremis, almost 400 kilometers away. Malabarman was educated with the collective fundraising of the Malo community. To them, he owed not only his life work, but also his textbooks and school uniforms. By the age of 20, his two parents, his two brothers, and his sister had passed away. In 1934, the bereft and bereaved Malabarman left home. He arrived in Kolkata. He began to work for Mohammadi, the journal founded by Muhammad Akram Khan, in which he began to write the stories that would become Titash. In 1945, however, he was without a stable income. After great labor, the sole handwritten manuscript of Titash was completed, but it was soon lost in the streets of Calcutta. Collecting, quote, his broken heart, Malabarman sat down to rewrite Titash, but now under new and dire circumstances. The partition of 1947 divided Bengal in two. Home was now a different country. Communalism and the choice theories of survival posed on new national minorities added to their struggles. The Malos of Brahmanbaria arrived in Calcutta as refugees. It is in this context that Titash is rewritten. Malabarman's friends, in the foreword to his novel, recounted the novelist's life during this time. Malabarman took on a second job to aid Malo refugees in Kolkata. Malabarman continued to barely keep himself fed, never married, and lived in a pigeonhole room on the industrial edge of town. Returning home late in the evenings, his body exhausted, he would peer out of his window to imagine the river of his youth. Gradually, the soot-filled sky would fade and, quote, merge with the pastel skies that leaned over the river of Titash. In 1951, Malabarman handed his second manuscript over to friends and was hospitalized for tuberculosis. He recovered for a moment and then passed away at the age of 37. 5 years later, Titash was posthumously published. That same year, in 1956, Pakistan Shell Oil Company began prospecting over 10,000 square miles of territory in East Pakistan. In Brahmanbaria, they found the most abundant site of natural gas in the region. The subsequent transformation of Brahmanbaria into a natural gas colony was consonant with a modernizing vision promoted by the Pakistani state. However, it was a vision more invested in symbolism and extraction than in redressing the inequalities between Pakistan's two wings. An extractive economic relationship rendered the East, as some historians have described it, as a de facto internal colony of the Western wing. The critique of inequality was a core rallying point for the Awami League and a major part of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's All-Pakistan electoral campaign in 1970. What happened after the failure of state federalism and the democratic transfer of power is perhaps well known to some. The Awami League won 167 out of 169 seats in East Pakistan. The military was secretly mobilized, and by the end of March, Operation Searchlight was launched, inaugurating one of the most concentrated genocides of the late 20th century. The warless river imagined by Malabarman came to an end. Brahmanbaria was a frontier between Mukti Bahini and the Pakistani military. Pakistani troops landed in Gukarnagat, Malabarman's childhood village, though the village had been evacuated prior to the siege. During the war, rivers became nationalist symbols, evincing a Bengali localist intimacy with the terrain. Riverine geographies in particular were strategically leveraged by peasant fighters as, quote, ecologies of emancipation. Their mastery of and mutability with nature was taken to furnish their patriotic claims to the country, often confounding to outsiders, a space that James Rennell in 1780 described as, quote, a labyrinth of rivers and creeks. It was in distinction to Pakistani soldiers from the West, who were denounced as anachronisms by Chaudhry Bangla Radio across the border in Kolkata. But in addition to this triumphalist national symbolism, rivers also figured prominently in wartime accounts of displacement, fleeing, fording, drowning, and death. Ghatak was born in 1925 in Dhaka. His attraction to the world of Titash was the past itself. Titash has become a tribute to the days I left behind, inextricably related to my childhood. It was a childhood tied to rivers, days spent on the banks of the Podda, sailors and fishermen, drizzling rain, the bells of the sarong, Muslim peasants dancing and singing with brass anklets. Ghatak remembers, quote, so many sounds, so many pictures, so much emotion, a civilization, a flowing stream. The Bangladesh War upturned Ghatak. He directed a short call-to-action documentary featuring a Bengali freedom fighter narrating the war, and a slew of experimental sound techniques and Eisensteinian montage, quoting Battleship Potemkin at one point directly. Ghatak is often represented as a shorthand for partition itself. Titash is understudied in Ghatak criticism, perhaps for this very reason. Nevertheless, Titash helps us to reconsider that Ghatak co-signed to historical pessimism and mourning, the artist as exemplary sufferer, as Susan Sontag may put it. Titash reminds us that Ghatak is not exclusively, quote, an Indian interlocutor or worse, national myth. His senses of belonging are also regionalist and internationalist, as we see in the case of Bangladesh. He framed his enthusiasm not in, quote, the political definition of Bangladesh as a nation state, but to an older cultural space tokened in that very name, a space cohered by Bengal's rivers. Here you can find a quote by Ghatak on the screen. Ghatak described his arrival in Dhaka in 1972. When we crossed Podda by air, I burst into tears. Satyajit Babu was by my side. I felt that Bengal, in plenty and beauty as I knew her years back, was still there, untransformed. Ghatak described the childlike feeling that time stood motionless there. Out of this childlike simplicity of intellect and fancy, Titash originated. Flux had seemingly been suspended, but in the new country, Ghatak faced disillusionment. Indeed, he was unable to, quote, trace the pastness of this place. In the end, as a rule, quote, history had destroyed all the beautiful things that existed before. Perhaps Bangladeshis felt this way too after the war. An anecdote recorded in Anup Singh's The Name of a River connects Ghatak's haunted passion and the deprived space of post-war Bangladesh. Having arrived in Dhaka, Ghatak discovered there was no expendable paper in the country after the war, and so he began to write the script on his shirt until someone intervened and offered him a starched white sari to write the script of Titash. In the course of filmmaking, Ghatak fell deeply ill. Flown back to Kolkata and unable to complete the film, he sent directions for the final cut to the Bangladeshi crew. Ghatak did not even see a rush print. Ghatak supposedly pitched another Indo-Bangladeshi feature, though after 1975, a military coup involving the assassination of Mujib occurred, and even if Ghatak were to survive, it would not have been feasible. Ghatak passed away 1 year later in 1976, 50 years old at the time of his death. Titash is a narrative of what Navida Khan describes as home and its constant vanishing. It is a story that ends in the drying of a river and the collapse of a society. In Malabarman's novel, there is a tactile and haptic foreshadowing of what is to come. The fishermen who had known the river for generations felt its changes. Quote, "The current where we knew it to be slanted was now straight, and where we knew it to be straight was now slanted. Fishes disappeared and silk beds appeared. Village folk left their homes or stayed in the hope that next season the river would be replenished. These people would starve, and the final moments of the novel imply that the village had become an unmarked graveyard." In Ghatak's film, the desertification of the river is instantaneous and almost mythic. The death of the river is moralized and connected to an exploitative assault on Malo unity, whereas Malabarman offers a more naturalistic description of siltbed formation. Ghatak is more interested in the allegorical. Ending in a sweeping panorama of desert and sand, the feeling is that this is not just the end of the village, but a planetary end as well. Adwaita Babu has done the natural. He ends it in ruins. Everything is shattered down, says Ghatak. But he clarifies the departure of his version, one evinced by a final shot of the dying character Bashanti seeing the mirage of a child running through fields of wheat. Quote, "My hint at the end is a new order, the new life that is struggling to be born. You may call it Marxism, or you may not see any political view in it. In Ghatak's view, apocalypse is not a declensionist premise. Environmental crises operate not on a linear time, but a cyclical one for Ghatak. Quote, human civilization is deathless in his final word. In fictions of the end, we may note that water is a recurring specter. One thinks of Gilgamesh, the big book of flood, even Ishmael's discourse in Moby Dick on the universal cannibalism of the sea. But the eschatological narrative of Titash breaks from this familiar model. It is not a story of the flood myth, but the disappearance of a river. But like the world flood, it is an eschatology about the end of a faintly held together equilibrium in the world that allowed human life to exist in the first place. In breaking the model of the flood, desertification brings about its own imagistic associations, particularly in Ghatak's film. The construction of the Farakka barrage, which threatened the distribution of Gangetic water flows to Bangladesh, led to one of the largest protests in post-independence history. We see here Maulana Bashani, the then 95-year-old peasant leader, who led a protest march to the Indian border in 1976. The aftermath of Farakka was the desertification of 54 rivers in Bangladesh. Today, anthropocentric climate change unevenly affects the world. Bengal is one of its most vulnerable frontiers, with 2/3 of Bangladesh being less than 15 feet above sea level. Against this horizon of expectations, Bengali cultural production expresses today, as it has in the past, an uneasiness in regards to its blue geographies. This is one way to interpret the eschatological tinge of Titash. But another way to think of eschatology in Titash is by considering the function of the end, with a capital E, as a site in which the whole can be seen at last, a vision of finality mirrored by exile, an Archimedean point outside of Flux. In Titash, we find a curious humanism in the eschatological, that which Frank Kermit suggests in his rhetorical question: what need can be more profound than to humanize the common depth? Indeed, the river of eventual lapse and tragedy in Malabarman's novel is for the people who once lived on its shore, also a name that hangs like a garland around their necks. Thank you very much.